Hello, and welcome to the 7th episode of Let's Learn Blades in the Dark. In this episode, we are going to discuss stress and trauma. So let's begin with stress. Stress is something we've discussed at length so far in these videos, but to give a precise definition of it, it is a special reserve of fortitude and luck. It starts plentiful, and it becomes scarce as PCs progress through the game. So what John Harper explains is the purpose of the stress system is as follows. The PCs in the game start out as huge underdogs. The stress system gives them a special ability to survive when they otherwise wouldn't, so they have some hope of achieving their long-term goals. And we're going to see exactly why this is necessary when we get into the tier system of the game and other sorts of factors that prove that the PCs begin the game as huge underdogs. So it's not just a matter of having to make action rolls causing problems for them. There's actually many ways in which the game sort of starts out stacked against them, and stress is the way they can overcome the odds that are stacked against them. So that promotes the idea of, well, it basically promotes the fictional concept of the game as these kind of scoundrels trying to get their way by hook or by crook to the top of Duskfall society, right? So the mechanics here at a very fundamental level are designed to support the kind of narrative that Blades in the Dark does. So we've talked about this also in various videos before, but I just wanted to review the point of pushing yourself. Just kind of sum it up in one place. So pushing yourself involves getting bonuses that can be chosen in exchange for 2 stress. So one case where you can push yourself is you can add +1 dice to, or +1 die to your roll. And this could be any roll where extra effort would help, but, you know, an obvious example is the action roll. You can also add +1 level to your effect. Or you can take an action when you're incapacitated. And incapacitated is a condition you get when you have taken level 3 harm. So the only way you can act at that point is to burn stress in order to push yourself. Alright, so let's continue here and discuss the differences between trauma and harm. So trauma is a separate system from harm and consequences. And this is obvious if you take a look at your character sheet. So you can see here the section of the Blades in the Dark character sheet that deals with stress, trauma, and harm. The top section here deals with stress and trauma. So you can see the stress track and the trauma track, and then also the trauma conditions you can take as a player character. And then at the bottom, you can see that there is the harm track. And these are 2 separate systems. And in this video, I'm going to talk about how these systems are interconnected. So trauma, it begins to fill when a PC marks their last stress box and they suffer a level of trauma. So as we saw in the previous slide here, there are a number of stress boxes in the stress track, and when they all fill up, then you mark 1 point in the trauma track, and you circle a trauma condition on your sheet. So those again are something we saw on the sheet. However, if you want to see more detail about what these trauma conditions mean, then take a look at page 14 in the book, because it provides a short description of what each of them are supposed to represent. If you take a level of trauma and circle a trauma condition, your PC is left for dead or otherwise dropped out of the current scene or score. So the consequence of taking a trauma condition is not simply taking the condition itself. It is also ditching out of the current score and leaving your teammates, your crewmates, exposed without your help. Okay? So there is a severe consequence to taking trauma aside from just the condition. After the score is finished, or after the scene's finished, the PC will come back, usually in the next downtime phase, which is, again, a thing we'll get to, and they will have 0 stress, clear their stress track entirely, and their vice, another system we're going to get to in a subsequent video, will be satisfied for that phase. So they don't need to satisfy their vice for the downtime phase when they return. They're at 0 stress, their vice is cleared, they're ready to go for the next job. So to get more into trauma conditions, they are permanent, and they can be used to gain XP, another system we're going to talk about, by causing trouble for the player character. So after marking their 4th trauma condition, the player character must retire or go to prison to reduce the crew wanted level. Wanted level, another system we're going to get into. So we're seeing, when we go through this whole stress discussion, all of these things that kind of tie into the downtime phase. How much trauma conditions affect the PC is entirely up to the player and how much they want to use them to gain XP. So, let's think about this. As it said before, if you take trauma, you are taken out of the job, out of the score. That has an automatic, significant mechanical penalty on the effectiveness of your crew, and that is something that can't be toyed with or manipulated by the player. The player chooses to take that stress. They choose to max out their stress track. Say they're making a resistance roll. It's close. They're almost maxed out, but they say, maybe I can make it. Maybe I'm just going to take 2 stress instead of 4 that I would need to max out. Unfortunately, they make a bad roll. They max out their stress track. They take a trauma condition, and they're kicked out of the score. Okay, can't do anything about that. That's just how the game goes. However, the trauma condition consequences are something they can control entirely. And it's basically something they can game by putting their character into situations where the trauma condition they have negatively affects them. And you can think about this in a similar way to traits in the Burning Wheel, where you want to play to your traits in order to gain experience points and progress your character. So the next part here, I want to talk exactly about how the stress system and the harm system are interrelated. And I say this is PC termination, but that might not be the best way to describe what's going on here. Essentially, what I want to explain is how harm, consequences, and trauma flow out of the action roll, and how these lead in various ways to a significant change of state in the player character. So either the player character is dying, or they're transforming into something else, or they're retiring. Basically, things that lead to a very significant shift in the narrative. I put termination here, but there are some cases where play will continue with this character anyhow. But let's get into it. It'll all become clear when I show this off. So we start with the action roll, right? We start with action. It involves making an action roll. The action roll can lead to harm. Okay, we talked about that. It can also lead to consequences. Again, we've discussed it. And it can indirectly lead to trauma. How? By way of stress. So stress coming out of the action roll comes from the player character pushing themselves, and it comes from consequences by way of the player character making a resistance roll, and it comes from harm by the player character making a resistance roll or pushing themselves after they have 3 harm, right? Because otherwise they can't act. All of these things contribute stress, and eventually that will max out and you get trauma. Trauma leads to trauma conditions, as we just discussed. If you get 4 of those, you will either retire or you will go into incarceration and reduce the wanted level of your crew. Okay, so that is what flows out of trauma. Conditions leading to the retirement or incarceration. If you choose not to make a resistance roll against fatal harm, your character will die. This gives you the option to either start a new PC or to become a ghost. From ghost, you can become a hull, or you can become a vampire. And there's one final special case that we need to discuss, and we're going to get into the detail on this next. It is possession. So if your player character comes into contact with a demon or spirit, they may become possessed. And when they become possessed, they will take trauma every week until it maxes out, and they either die or they directly become a vampire, skipping the ghost step entirely, because the spirit that has possessed them merges with their corpse and becomes a vampire. This is how the whole system works, how it all flows out of the action roll. And what I want to note is that what flows out of the action roll is decided, in the first case, mostly by the GM, right? So the GM decides if there's going to be harm or there's going to be consequences. The player gets to decide everything after that. Okay? The player's deciding whether they want to make resistance rolls or push themselves. That leads to trauma. Get enough of those, that's mechanically dictated. There's no 2 ways around it. It leads to getting trauma conditions, and whether the character retires or is incarcerated is determined by the player. Whether or not the character resists fatal harm and dies is also up to the player. Whether they choose to become a new PC or become a ghost is also up to the player. The question of whether they become a hull or a vampire is something that needs to be established in the fiction through discussion with the GM, but ultimately the choice is up to the player. So what I want to emphasize is that every single path to PC termination is determined by the player. This is quite unlike many other RPGs. Think about it. In Dungeons & Dragons 5e, you're going to make your death save, and if you fail it, right, like, okay, you're going to take damage because of what the DM rolled. You're going to max out your damage. You're going to make a death save. If you fail your death save, you're dead. That's it. Okay? No player choice there at all. In Dungeon World, if your character takes too much damage, then you're going to make the Death's Door move, right? You are going to roll to see if you make a bargain with death, you recover from death, or you simply die, right? The GM has the option of offering you a way out of death, making a bargain with death himself. But that is the GM's option. So the player does get to choose whether they want to take death's deal or not. However, the GM has significantly more contribution, I would say, to the fate of the character. And so, in a way, you could compare this player control over character termination to... It's more like fate, maybe, would be a good analogy. Sorry if I got mixed up about Dungeon World there. I might have the details wrong. But that's just what I remember. Because I think the real important thing there is that the specifics of the deal that the GM offers the player in Dungeon World are determined by the GM, whereas the PC has tons of control over what kind of path they take to PC termination. Like, all of these paths past the initial row are all determined by the player character, or by the player. So this sets Blades in the Dark apart from other games. It's quite interesting, and in the main, the important thing here is that it removes pressure from the GM to manage danger and make sure that the PCs don't die in a way that is going to make the players dissatisfied. Because the players have the control over when and how their character dies. So no longer does the GM have to stress about when and how the player characters are going to die and whether they're going to upset the players, because it's all in the player's hands. So that is quite a interesting and principled design decision by John Harper that I think is really quite interesting here. All right, let's move on. Let's discuss this supernatural stuff just to wrap things up here. So stress and the supernatural, we've kind of already covered this, but I'm just going to blow through it. So the player character comes into a close encounter with a spirit or demon, and they either freeze up or flee, or they choose to resist with resolve. Whispers, railjacks, and occultists are less susceptible to the influence of the supernatural. And the way that this role works, or situation works, is like a Burning Wheel steel test in reverse. Because in Burning Wheel, if you come into an encounter with the supernatural, just like in Blades in the Dark, your character gets into a bad situation. And in Burning Wheel, first you roll to see if you can resist. And if you fail, then you choose, am I going to freeze up? Am I going to flee? Or whatever. In Blades in the Dark, it is assumed by default that you freeze up or flee. And you can choose to roll to resist. And you automatically succeed. It's just how much stress you spend on that, right? So it puts, again, more power in the player's hands and contributes to the game as a conversation. All right, possession. So if the character stands there and the GM decides it's interesting to have them possessed by a spirit, then the player character is possessed. And if they are possessed, they take 1 trauma at the end of each week until it maxes out the 4th trauma condition. In this special case, the spirit can bond with the corpse to become a vampire, or the PC dies. This is up to the player. And finally, we have mind-bending horrors, which are like spirits or demons. However, they're more significant. So, like the physical manifestation of a forgotten god. Basically, if things get very Lovecraft in your scenario, then you might want to invoke these rules. They can cause a character to freeze, flee, or suffer additional effects on sight. So there's some further horrific thing that happens beyond what they would experience from encountering a demon or a spirit. And this can still be resisted with a resistance roll, because the resistance roll is always available, no matter the circumstance. It's just a matter of whether you want to spend that stress or not. Alright, so that's been a long video, and in the next one we're going to get to another significant system, which is clocks. I will see you then.